Welcome everybody to the panel on Equitable Clean Energy Future, Laying a Pathway. Just a couple of quick reminders. I'll share this very quickly before we get into the discussion here. You are obviously, if you're looking for the Equitable Clean Energy Future, you're in the right spot. As we kind of go through today, I obviously have to start by thanking our host, the Cleveland Public Library. Without their support and help, it would have been very difficult to pull off this virtual summit this year. So a lot of thank yous out to the Cleveland Public Library for providing the support we needed to make this happen today. As we kind of go through, if you want to enlarge your screen, you'll see a little arrow that will actually shrink the chat polls people in Twitter box. That will make your screen a little bit larger so that it's a little bit easier to see some of the materials that are being presented today. So if you want to go ahead and do that, feel free. As we go through, you're going to be muted throughout the event, but we do want your comments and questions. So feel free to drop those right in the chat box. As our panelists will kind of go through their remarks, we'll definitely have some time at the end for questions and answers. I'll keep an eye on that and we'll try to moderate and facilitate those questions as much as we can. And then again, as you're watching the presentation, if you want to enlarge it even further, you'll see three dots kind of in the upper right screen. You can transition that into full screen, which will make it nice and large on your machine so you can see the presentations at a very detailed level as we move forward. And then obviously we'd love to connect with you longer term. So here are all of our social media handles. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or visit our website, www.sustainablecleveland.org. So if you joined us this morning for the larger discussion about the state of sustainable Cleveland, this is a little bit of a repeat, but I did think it's important to set the context as we move into our discussion today. When we look at our climate action plan, emissions reduction is really at the heart of that document. In 2013, we set a goal to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% over a 2010 baseline by 2050. We are moving along that process. We've seen a 9% reduction in emissions. And more importantly, or as importantly, I think we're starting to see some decoupling between our greenhouse gas emissions and economic activity. So we're becoming more energy efficient as we produce and make and build things. But we still have a lot of work to do to hit that emissions reduction goal. And as we have that conversation, we have to focus on energy use because it makes such a large percentage of our overall emissions profile. If you look at that chart on the right, we see that about 49% or nearly half of all of our local emissions are coming from energy use. So the city of Cleveland, through our climate action plan, has adopted two sub-goals related to energy use to really help us move forward this. One of those is to get to 25% of our electricity supplied from renewable sources by 2030. This is really utilizing what we've done through Cleveland Public Power, through our Advanced Energy Portfolio Standard, what we've done through our Community Choice Aggregation Program and backing that with 100% RECs. But we want to make sure that we're focusing on the demand side of the equation too. And this really looks at transitioning to 100% of electricity demand from clean and renewable sources by 2050. Earlier this year, we released our report, Cleveland's Clean and Equitable Energy Future, which was really our roadmap to help us get to that point. We won't go into too much detail in the report. We can drop a link to it in the chat if you want to read through it. It's a very interesting document. But there are three big takeaways that we have to keep in mind as we start this discussion we're going to have. And one is that our ability to do what we want to do locally and achieve these local goals we have is constrained by state policy. I don't think that's anything earth-shattering to anyone on this call, and I think we know that this is impacting what we can do from a large scale, which means we have to get creative in how we seek solutions. So even within those constraints at the state level, if we can find those creative solutions to move forward, we can absolutely have a positive impact on some of those key goals that we have as a community. If we did everything available to us according to our clean energy report, we could see about we could cut energy burden about in half. We could create about 5,000 additional jobs with about $1.5 billion of income growth by 2050. And we could see some significant positive impacts on human and neighborhood health. And we have made a lot of progress. There are a lot of good things that we've done as a community. And now we need to start to focus on how we implement pieces and parts of this policy toolkit that was contained in the report as we look to move forward. And the panelists that we have with us today are really some of the best voices to help us talk about that. Today, we are happy to be joined on this discussion by first and foremost Tristan Rader, who is the Ohio Program Director for Solar United Neighbors, which is really kind of the key principal agent in the county solar co-op. who will give us a pretty good snapshot of what we're looking and what we see from a residential on-site solar situation. We also have with us today Michael Jeans, who is the president and CEO of Growth Opportunity Partners, a small business advisory, investment and lending community financial institution that's really taking a lead in trying to help us identify ways we can get more active and more engaged around community solar, which, full disclosure, in our clean energy report was one of the highest scoring policy programs that we have available to us. So this is going to be a really interesting discussion. And of course, we're joined by John Mitterholzer, who I'm sure everybody on this call knows, who is a senior program officer at the George Gunn Foundation, and is one of the most knowledgeable people on energy we have in our region, who's going to share kind of a bigger picture perspective and give us a little bit of context. So with that, Tristan, I will turn it over to you to kind of jump into the residential solar options.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. This is a great opportunity to be with you here today. A great panel to be on. I'm honored to be here with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if for some reason you can't see it, let me know. Otherwise, I believe we are good to go. So again, I'm Tristan Rader, and thanks for that introduction. I'm the Ohio Program Director for Solar United Neighbors here in Ohio. And what we're going to cover today in this snapshot of what we do as an organization, but also just generally where we want to see the country head. And I apologize for the train. I'm in Lakewood, and you don't live anywhere in Lakewood where you're not within this distance of a train. But that's okay. Density is good, by the way. That's a different presentation. Anyway, so it's the goal of our organization is transforming the grid one rooftop at a time. And we believe that rooftop solar really is that cornerstone that's going to get us to that future we want, a future that is clean, inclusive. It's also resilient, right? We know that solar and renewable energies has this capacity potential, if distributed, to actually be much more reliable than our current grid or unstable current grid. And how we get there is just like that. We have to decentralize, distribute our generation, and we have to democratize. I think that's really one of the keys is democratizing our energy system. That means that the most people end up with the most control or ownership or receive the most value, right? And renewable energy, specifically solar, is an excellent way to do that. And I'm really looking forward to some of these other presentations later on that get more at that. But right now, let's focus on the rooftop solar question. And we'll talk a little bit about how rooftop solar works, just generally, so we have a baseline. One of the biggest questions we get asked on a daily basis is, does rooftop solar specifically work in Ohio, right? We'll answer that question or begin to talk about the solar co-op, and then we'll get into this question of equity before we hand it off to the next presenter. So how solar works. Well, when we mention solar, we talk about photovoltaic solar. That's the solar that actually converts sun energy into electricity. And it does that through solar panels or solar arrays that, in our cases, they're attached to a roof or in a field somewhere. And these solar arrays are grid tied. So they're actually producing energy for your home. And then if that energy is being overproduced, you're producing more energy in your home's using at any given moment, you're feeding it onto the grid for someone else, for your neighbors to use, essentially. And then at night or in the winter time, when there's not as much sun, you're using energy from the grid. So it's a seamless integration into your lifestyle, into the modern American lifestyle here. And the most basic component of that system really is the solar panel. These panels have come light years from where they were 50 years ago when they were first developed. They're much more efficient, much more energy dense, and much less expensive, and extremely durable with 30-year warranties, very common across the top tier panels here in the United States. So not the only thing you need, right? There's a lot more that goes into a solar system than just the panels. And actually attaching them to your roof is a big portion of the cost. And the largest portion of that cost is actually labor. And that's another reason that the solar industry and distributed solar, small scale solar, is crucial. This energy transition is going to create tons of jobs, clean energy careers across America. We know that. We're seeing that boom here in Ohio. We're leading that with 10% job growth over the last few years in the solar industry alone. We know this is a great way to really make this transition happen. So a couple considerations when it comes down to roofs. Now, almost all roofs work for solar, whether they're asphalt or shake or slate, but direction, shading, age, and materials are the four main components. Here in Ohio, you want to make sure you have a roof that's either south facing, east or west facing work fine. The solar that's on my roof, like the very first slide was actually my roof. It's an east-west facing roof, and it works great for solar. Slate works fine for solar. There's actually a picture of one of this called the solar co-op installs we did in Shaker, Chris's house, and it was actually installed in the winter and on slate. So it works. It works just fine nowadays. Also, if you don't have the room on your roof's too old, you can always do a solar array on another part of your property that's attached to your meter, still giving you what you need. And you know, that's how solar works generally, right? And like I said, I have solar on my roof. We've done over 350 installs here in the state of Ohio. Many of the larger installers in the state have done tons more installs than we've touched. But still, the question you may be asking is, does solar still work in Ohio? Does it really work in Ohio? You know, snow, weather are concerns people have on their minds, and the fact that we only really get an average of 4.26 hours of sunlight during the year. But the economics bear out that solar does work in Ohio. We'll talk just a second about that. So here is a graph of the average home in the United States consumes about 10,000 kilowatt hours a year. That's what these monthly blue usage bars mean. This is like the usage throughout a year for your energy. The orange bars here represent the solar someone might generate to cover that amount of usage. So you can see here in the summer months, you're producing way more energy than you're using in a given month. So what happens? What happens with this additional energy at the top of the range here that you're not using or putting back into the grid? Well, fortunately here in Ohio, we have something called net metering, which literally allows your meter. This is actually my meter, believe it or not, before they switched out my digital meter. When I was producing solar at a bright sunny day in May, and my meter was running backwards quite fast. So at the end of the month, you're only really charged for the energy you use once you subtract the energy you produce. So it's actually a mechanism by which you're able to accrue credit. And then in these months that you don't produce as much solar as you did in the months in the summer, you can actually draw down on those credits. It's like an accounting battery of sorts that actually allows the math to work out. So that here in Ohio, 1 kilowatt of solar on somebody's home, it's equivalent to 3 panels on somebody's home of solar, will produce 1,200 kilowatt hours of energy, which is about $150 of value for that homeowner. So what does that mean? What does that break down to? Well, if you look at an average size system of 8 kilowatts, it's about 20, 25 panels of solar, you're looking at about a 10 or 11 year payback period on that solar. So it actually does work for folks. That's also taking into consideration the 26% tax credit, which is important. So all this information is on our website, by the way. So I highly recommend you check it out. These slides are there. You can grab them and kind of dig into them a little bit deeper. But like I said, that 26% tax credit is super important, crucial. It's come down a bit, but it's planned on, it's actually going to stay through 2022. This is an old slide. So it's held at 26% through the end of 2022. This is a very old slide. Apologies for the old slide. So which is nice. If you look at this 2020, which is actually 2021, we're working under right now. If you have a solar system that's worth or you paid $19,250 for, at the end of the year, when you do your taxes, you're actually going to get about $5,000 back. That 26% tax credit is actually good through the end of 2022. It's been held constant. So that's a good thing. That's a huge reason why the solar industry is growing, and it's a good thing. Another thing that we're doing, this is really what we're known for as an organization, and we're partnering with the county sustainability office on this. We work with the city of Cleveland. We're also the provider of the solar co-op for the city of Columbus and a few other places. It's basically an educational bulk buying program that pulls people together across the region, and then we use that bulk buying power to leverage the best deal possible from local solar installers. So it keeps the solar local. We get to vet these great proposals that these installers do for us, and then the members of the co-op get pretty much the best proposal that they could hope for. And it's just a great way to pull together demand and leverage that demand to get a good price and get a quality product into people's hands. So here in Cuyahoga, we've done just about half of the installs in the whole state because we've got a great partnership, a great program here, and a number of those are in the city of Cleveland. So we've done over, at this point, 150 installs just in the county alone. So Cuyahoga County really is leading in rooftop solar, and we're proud to be the partner that helps make that happen. But still, is solar equitable? Is rooftop solar specifically equitable? And it's a hard question to answer. You know, we know that it's decentralized. Yes, when you put solar on roofs, you're actually generating energy all over the place, right? There's not one central plant generating energy. You're generating energy all over the place, and that also speaks to its distribution, right? Is it being produced in more than one place? But is it democratic? And that's a really open question. Yes, yeah, you could say that solar is owned by a vast majority more people than a vast number more people than just your monopoly utility, right? But is it everybody? Is it renters? Is it people that don't own their homes? Rooftop solar is pretty much for people that own their homes, right? And own their homes in areas that aren't like homeowners associations or places, municipalities, unlike Cleveland, that have regressive laws or punitive laws around rooftop solar. So in order to address the inequities in solar, we need something called community solar. And I'll stop there because I think that we'll have a presenter up here real quick that's going to be talking all about community solar, how it works, and where we're at with the county, here in the county and in the city with community solar. I'm super excited to hear more about it. But that's a little bit about us. I'll throw a link in the chat that has the solar co-op, which we actually just got open today. For the summit, you can pre-sign up for the launch. It's going to be on November 9th of the solar co-op here in Cuyahoga County. And that's again going to run through the beginning of next year, but you may be able to get it installed on this year if we get people in soon, if we get it built large enough quickly here. So thank you all very much for your time. I'll leave it at that. And if you have any other questions, feel free to get at me.
Thank you very much, Tristan. It was a great way to start the conversation and a natural segue into our next presenter's discussion. So without any further ado, actually, before I do that, if you've got questions for Tristan, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Like I said, we will have some time at the end. Make sure you're in the session chat. Drop that question in there and we'll answer them at the end. And with that, we'll turn it over to Michael to kind of start talking about the next kind of level of this.
Thank you, Chief Wood, and good afternoon to each of you attending the session. Tristan, as always, it's a pleasure to hear what you're working on. I think sometimes we miss how much activity is actually happening here in Cuyahoga County and in Cleveland as it relates to such innovations as rooftop solar. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. I'm President and CEO of GrowthOps. It's a shortened version of Growth Opportunity Partners by name. And I'm also representing Go Green Energy, which is Ohio's green bank and the first African-American-led green bank created in the country. We have been supported by the George Gunn Foundation, and so I'd like to thank the foundation for supporting us in establishing a green bank. The green bank essentially allows us to access a federal network and federal funds to support clean energy and renewable solutions across the state. Of course, GrowthOps is located here in Cleveland, Ohio. And so our focus and some of our early work is happening here in the city and in the region. Our sustainability statement I wanted to share with you because we're talking about solar today, and I'm going to share with you what we're doing in the community solar space. But we're really talking about what role we play in climate change and the effects of climate change. And so our statement to this is that we're committed to being a leader in environmental sustainability. At GrowthOps, we believe the risks of climate change warrant the intentional actions of companies, government, and global citizens if we're to make meaningful progress. And we believe it's our responsibility as global citizens to take care of the planet we inherited and the world's children who will someday inherit as well. And so GrowthOps has been tasked from inception to improve the quality of life of low-income persons, which ultimately improves the quality of life and the economics of entire communities. And in addition to that, we're tasked with solving persistent challenges and problems. And so one of the things you heard from Tristan just a moment ago was the notion of whether solar is equitable and whether rooftop is equitable and dare I say perhaps the overall work itself. Well, community solar begins to solve for some of that. And so you just heard about rooftop solar and how that might fit on your home. There are applications through PPAs that could work on businesses, but community solar allows the residents and allows businesses to buy energy through a subscription or via subscription. And as a result, the buyer or the homeowner is considered a subscriber. Tristan mentioned the net metering, and that's something that's available in Ohio and or virtual net metering, and so that allows the subscriber to access energy that's generated from afar or remote, hence virtual net metering. And so what we're doing at GrowthOps, we're excited about one of our first projects, but what we're doing is, we believe that it's good to be able to access clean energy, to be able to, maybe save some dollars on an energy bill or an electric bill, but we didn't think that was enough. And through the lens of equity and opportunity and innovation, how could we make this more? How could we make it better and have greater impact? And so while we continue down the path of energy cost reduction, as you may know, the energy burden in Ohio and in Cuyahoga County is higher than we'd like it to be. And so how can we reduce some of that burden, particularly for those who have lower or limited income? And so on the income statement side of things, you get the energy, the utility offset. But what we've also done is where we roll out community solar, the subscribers, which just was defined a moment ago, will have an opportunity to access equity in the project. Our pursuit is not to enrich GrowthOps. It's to transfer equity where it can be transferred. And so there'll be true ownership of the project for those who live in the community where the solar arrays are situated, and who also enroll as subscribers. Now, in doing so, that creates balance sheet. Immediately, there are ownership positions that would show up on a personal financial statement. Think of ownership in a company. So would the residents have ownership. So year one is where we see the beginning of expense offset. And year two, at the end of year two, is when we begin to see a transfer of the first 20% of equity in the project. And that cascades and sunsets at year five, where 100% of ownership in the modeling we've created transfers to our low-income residents. We're currently working with CMHA, with our Section 8 population, as well as some of the streets that are adjacent, so that we can create true economic mobility. And in doing so, the equity that would have been garnered through managing energy consumption through community solar and the subscribers, that equity, should those households decide they're ready to buy their own home and perhaps exit Section 8, we will redeem those their ownership positions so that they can use the funds for down payment, for energy efficiency inside of their home. It is what will catalyze, set in motion and then catalyze economic mobility for our lower income residents, some of whom are part of our more vulnerable population. So when you think about how community solar shows up, this is the new infrastructure, if you will. We all drive down streets and we see the power lines. We see infrastructure above ground, and unfortunately, we're reminded of how old our infrastructure is below ground. So this effort in community solar is tested. Tristan shared with us just a moment ago, perhaps a limited number of sunny days in Northeast Ohio. But one of the misconceptions that folks like Tristan and I and John Mitterholzer have to share is that you don't need the hottest of days and the sunniest of days to generate solar energy and to capture it. In fact, it's the days that aren't quite so warm that are the most efficient and effective in generating or capturing energy and storing it. So Northeast Ohio is certainly a prime location for these activities. There's a bit of sense of urgency, if you will. And so some states have been at this for some time. And there's been tax incentive at the state level. Tristan shared the federal tax incentive. But at our state level, we're not where we could be, perhaps where we should be. And so through the work of GrowthOps and others, our goal is to create models. And we have created models that mimic incentive. If you mimic incentive, you encourage investment. And if we encourage investment, then the platform for renewable and clean energy becomes normalized. it becomes funded, the costs go down over time. So at GrowthOps, our goal is to begin driving this innovation in our inner cities. This is not going to be a repeat of perhaps times past where we start at other locations and wait for that to flow into the inner city or to the urban core. We're going to begin in our center mass, and we're going to create equity, and we are creating equity for the residents who decide to subscribe and enroll. There's a heavy education component, and so we've created GrowthOps Academic Lab. The acronym is GOAL. I believe you can't have a good project without a bad acronym, so there you are, folks. That's ours. GOAL is the academic lab for GrowthOps. We are doing the build out, and we'll be ready for you Q1 of next year with support from Bank of America in assisting us in building out the lab. But effectively, we're going to be credentialing individuals who would like to learn how to install rooftop solar. Initially, we're working with contractors, HVAC workers, and electricians who already have the competencies. It's not a large leap to add this toolkit to their tool belt and to their solution set. So we're controlling supply and demand. We're on the worker side creating quality jobs, as well as driving the infrastructure here in Northeast Ohio. And in the interest of full disclosure, we are working with our utility companies so that we can all do what's best for the residents of the city of Cleveland. And the folks on this panel today, all of us share an interest in improving the quality of life, improving our access to infrastructure, and connecting Cleveland and Northeast Ohio to a future that has a long path, that has a cleaner path, and one where our kids can work, live, play, and educate on roads and in neighborhoods that are clean and that are safe. Up next, you're going to hear from John Mitterholzer from the George Gunn Foundation, and John is going to tie in, why this is important for Northeast Ohio and the role that he's played over the years in bringing this kind of activity to Northeast Ohio. Please feel free to drop any questions into the chat feature, and we'll have time after John's presentation for Q&A. And with that, Chief Wood, I'll turn the floor back over to you.
Oh no, Michael, you just did my job for me. It's easy. We'll turn it right to John, and John, take it away. And like Michael said, drop those questions in the chat. We're going to have some time to get into the details here. So John, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Chief Wood. Thank you, Tristan and Michael. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel with both of you today. So as the director of the George Gunn Foundation's Climate Environmental Justice Program, I really do have the luxury of working and supporting work at the city of Cleveland, and also individuals like Tristan and Solar United Neighbors and Michael and Growth Opportunity Partners. So it's fun to be amongst friends, and I know many of you out there I've worked with for the more than a decade I've been working here in Cleveland around sustainability and climate change. My role here is to set a little bit of context, to look a little bit beyond Cleveland's boundaries and to sort of appreciate what it is that we're trying to accomplish here and why it's so important. I want to take us back to 2019. This is a difficult conversation moment for me to have, but I want to briefly just remind us about House Bill 6, and I will soon explain why. In 2019, House Bill 6 passed. We now know that it took $62 million in bribery money from First Energy in order for that bill to pass. And much has been talked about that bill. Some of you may be well aware that that bill bailed out our nuclear power plants. Some of you may also be aware that it bailed out 2 coal-fired power plants. You may not know that one of those coal-fired power plants was in fact in Indiana. So think about that for a minute. Our taxpayer dollars are paying for a coal plant not in our state. But what doesn't get as much conversation is the fact that it completely suspended the renewable portfolio standard here in Ohio. We had requirements that all of our public utilities needed to provide a percentage of their electricity with renewable resources. That's completely suspended and exists no longer. And then perhaps even more important is that our energy efficiency requirements in this state, which were some of the strongest in the United States, have also been suspended. As a direct result of that happening, Ohio has gone from being the 7th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States to the 3rd. And I really ask that you let that sink in. Only California and Texas have larger greenhouse gas emissions than Ohio. So when you think about this from a global perspective, if Ohio were a country, it would be the 26th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So what does that mean? It means that the work we do here in Cleveland matters. There is simply no way to address climate change globally without addressing it here in Ohio and in Cleveland. And I really want us all to understand that. We cannot solve climate change. We certainly cannot fend off catastrophic climate change without the work we do here in Cleveland and without leadership in the state of Ohio. And that is so important. I also want to remind us, as we're in the 12th Sustainability Summit, I'm proud to have been on the original design team of this. Cleveland has long been a leader in this space, and I think that's important for us to recognize. Cleveland was one of the very first cities in the United States to have a sustainability manager. They then elevated that position to chief of sustainability, and we were one of the first to do that. That's really exciting, and I'm really proud of that. Globally, Cleveland was one of the very first cities to commit to an 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I want to say that again. We were one of the leading cities in the world to do that. That's really important, and I'm really proud of that as well. We were one of the first cities in the United States to have a climate action plan. We were certainly one of the first cities in the United States to redo that plan so that it was centered in equity. I still think it's one of the best climate action plans in the United States because it is centered in equity, and I'm proud to have served on the advisory committee for that plan. And then finally, as Chief Wood said in his remarks, Cleveland just recently adopted its Clean and Equitable Energy Future Plan. That plan is so important to the work that we're all talking about today because it not only shows us how we can get to 100% clean energy, but it makes sure that we do so in a way that is centered in equity. That as we think about this really important transition that all cities across the world are trying to make to a carbon-free economy, we leave no one behind. We have to be honest about Cleveland and its history and its industrial past. The reality is that we've had moments in time of economic upheaval. And unfortunately, in those moments, we've left a whole lot of people behind. The majority of those people were people of color. There's an opportunity before us to transition to a carbon-free economy, to a clean energy economy in a very different way than we've transitioned in the past, centered in equity and making sure that we leave no resident of Cleveland behind. And what I want to leave us all with is that every city across the world is struggling with this issue. There's a moment in time, and that moment is now, for Cleveland to once again be a global leader, to figure out how we transition our economy to a carbon-free economy in a way that is not only equitable, but centers on the lowest income residents in our community, residents of color who have far too often been left behind in other transitions. And we have that chance right now to be the leader. As everyone is grappling with this issue, people are looking to places that are doing it right. And I believe that there's a lot of work that all of you who are participating in this today are working on that is doing it right. And I'm really proud to be able to support that work, to work for the George Gunn Foundation, and to work with leaders like Chief Wood, like Michael, and like Tristan. Thanks.
Thanks, John. That's a great way to kind of end the presentation and discussion portion. And I do see some questions starting to pop in the chat, but as the moderator, I'm going to take the privilege of the first one. And John, I'm going to put you right back on the spot a little bit here because you said something I think is really interesting, and I would encourage Michael and Tristan to jump in as well here. We've got a moment in time to be a leader on this, right? And to do it in a way that centers equity in our transition to clean energy. What would you see as the top two or three opportunities that we have in the city of Cleveland to really lead this equitable transition? What should we be looking at and what should we be doing? So John, I'll start with you, and then Michael and Tristan, obviously feel free to jump in if you'd like as well.
Yeah, well, I'm going to leave Michael to talk about community solar, but I think that is probably the top opportunity. I think the opportunity we have is to not just think about residents and how we ensure we make this transition in a way that doesn't impact the cost of energy that they have to pay for. But we also have the opportunity to think about existing businesses. And Michael, I'm going to steal your line and I apologize. But one of the things that Michael has shown me is that if you look at the HVAC companies that are out there, many of the installers have to take a moment in time away from work. They don't have enough work. They actually have to go on unemployment. There's an opportunity to expand the HVAC business to include solar installation that allows those employees to work full-time year-round. That also increases revenue for those businesses. And so I think the opportunity that's before us as we think about how do we center this on equity is to look at every sector of how do we really create jobs? How do we reduce energy costs? How do we expand businesses and minority-owned businesses? There are so many ways that we can do this right. And I think the big opportunity for us is to make sure that we look at it broadly. That's where I think we could fall down. We really need to think about all of the many ways that we have to center equity in this work. But if we do that, we are absolutely going to lead.
Yeah, I'd agree with John, not because he stole my line, but because we have to think big, right? And infrastructure, the nature of infrastructure is long. This is an opportunity for us to make big investments over time. So we're talking about the potential for wealth generation and economic mobility across generations. That's big picture thinking that's executable. As we think about community solar and the equity component, the moment of now resonates, and I think has a real good shot at being different, because we're starting with the investment of significant investment in innovation with people of color, in communities of color, in places of color. And that's just not how significant investment has typically occurred across the country. We've waited for that investment in other places and other people to somehow find its way, only to create phrases around people being left behind. So this time we're starting with our communities that are in our core, our people of color, and as we know, when we focus on our major metropolitan areas, the rest of the regions benefit, and going in the opposite direction just doesn't accomplish that. Lastly, we've got a globe that is committing to clean energy and net zero emissions. We have companies like Coca-Cola and American Airlines and JetBlue and Google and Ford and Unilever and Microsoft and BP. You've got corporations now who may have fatigued in the politics and recognize this is a meaningful investment. And today the worker is driving the trends. So I'm incredibly bullish in the time. And I'd like to see Cleveland continue to lead in this effort, certainly in the Midwest, and a model for the country.
Thank you very much. Michael, Jim Budinger asked a question for you regarding virtual net metering. So he asked, is virtual net metering now permitted in Ohio? He thought that it was blocked by the PUCO. Can you provide a little clarification on that for him?
Sure. This is probably John and Tristan's domain, so feel free to jump in. But virtual net metering is available in Ohio. It's what allows us to make these projects work. There's always the option of in front of the meter or behind the meter, but virtual net metering has the greatest efficiency and is more economical. And so I think some of the perceived barriers to solar and to community solar, through conversations like we're having today, we can abate some of those so we can wrestle with what are the true obstacles. And the reality is that all of them are manageable. Tristan, did you have any comments on that?
So my understanding is that net metering is allowed, actual net metering, where an individual that has solar in their home can take basically take a credit on their bill for the solar they overproduce. However, virtual net metering, I think what Jim's referring to is the mechanism by which you could remove that solar from your roof and have it somewhere else in the context of like community solar. That currently is not allowed by by statute. So in fact, if I'll share my screen here real quick, you might have saw this slide flashed up, but there's a community solar bill in the House just introduced. It's called HB 450, and it would allow for 3,000 megawatt hours of solar projects to be, undertaken here in the state of Ohio, and it fixes it to the net metering rate. It's a great. This would be the mechanism by which we could do community solar broadly, right? Fortunately, actually, in Cleveland, we have a public utility that could eventually enact its own policy to allow net metering, virtual net metering, without the need of a statute or any kind of decision from the PUCO. So that is something that I know that Jason's working really hard on, and Michael's working very hard on to get Cleveland Public Power to adopt some type of community solar so that Cleveland could do it aside from what the state could do. And I'm working very hard on the state piece, getting the state to do this community solar broadly. So that's all. Maybe did I do it okay there, Michael? John?
You did great, because I missed the clarification. So thanks for clarifying the virtual net metering for the audience versus net metering.
Yeah, and all I would do is just remind everyone that Cleveland Public Power is so important in this discussion. We are very lucky that we live in a city that has a public, I mean, it is truly our utility. It does not work for profit. It works for the residents of Cleveland. And that allows it to do things that they can actually bypass statutory requirements because we own it, because the residents own it. They don't have to go through the regular regulatory scheme that a publicly owned utility would have to. So that gives us a whole lot of flexibility here in Cleveland that a lot of other places simply don't have.
Thank you, everybody. And I think this is an interesting question from Kevin Jordan, and maybe stepping back a little bit, what is the scale of the increase of renewable energy in Ohio that we would need in order to replace coal? How should we be thinking about it in the larger context? And I think maybe if I can put a little finer point on it. So this is a panel that's really focused on a lot of distributed generation resources. Is that going to be enough, or do we need to look bigger at more utility scale development? And then how do we get to that?
Well, I'll just say it's coal. I would say natural gas is the big one. We have very little coal compared to natural gas generation in the state of Ohio. And then we do have still a significant slice of nuclear generation. So just to give a little bit of context, and there's very little renewable in the state of Ohio. What, 3%, less than 3%, something like that, John? And I'll let John speak, or Michael speak to the larger picture. I think they have a much better sense the next 10 years, 20 years here in Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're a little less than 80% fossil fuel. So Tristan's right. We now the majority of our fossil fuel is coming from natural gas. We do have a sizable chunk of nuclear. So it's quite a ways to go on the renewable side. I personally believe, distributed solar is so important for so many reasons. And what Tristan's doing in particular is really important, particularly for resiliency. I mean, as you really think about how do you become more resilient as a community, it's having those distributed solar pieces so that if one plant goes out, you've got a whole other opportunity around the resiliency piece. And in climate change, that's going to be ever more important. That said, we certainly are going to need far more utility scale wind and solar in the state of Ohio. There's no way to get to fossil free without significant utility scale. And that's really much more sizable, wind farms, solar farms that you would see, not necessarily in large urban areas, but outside of those areas. You need both. That's the answer, and we need them as fast as we can get them.
Not a whole lot to add to that, except to maybe put a spotlight on, solar is one piece of the renewable energy equation. And so we have momentum with solar across the country. There's a level of awareness and understanding that's increasing, and solar makes sense. But wind and geothermal and other forms of renewable energy in the aggregate are what will define the future of how energy is produced and consumed across the globe. And it's participation from large corporations that are making these long-term commitments to their fleets, which are contributing to some of our gas emissions challenges. That's going to help move the needle. So I think it scares some folks to think of replacement, kind of overnight, if you will, figuratively speaking. And so there'll be some coexistence for sure. And, I believe that renewable energy is going to outrun fossil fuel. In a society where we have capital markets, we'll need to ensure that we perform.
Thank you. So I see a few more questions popping in the chat, but there was one I wanted to follow up on a little bit. Michael, you touched on this notion of education being key and the creation of the academic lab to kind of make those connections. Can you tell us a little bit more about that program? And then ultimately, how can people connect to it if they want to make this kind of transition?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to share. As we looked at, where where are opportunities flowing in clean energy and in solar? And we just weren't seeing the level of diversity and participation that we wanted to see. And solar installation was one of those areas. So we went down the rabbit hole of what are the professions, what are the working areas where the work they do today would be complementary to solar installation. And that's why we landed on, and how we landed on HVAC. Some of our colleagues in the Green Bank Consortium across the country assisted us with that. So the platform effectively is, HVAC workers are already on rooftops. They're already, the electricians are working with such mechanisms. So as John mentioned earlier, this is a way for them to work when it's cold in Cleveland. They can work on projects where it's warm. And where their traditional projects tend to sunset, they can add this to their business. What does that mean for the business owner? It means that there's year-round revenue rather than simply year-round expenses. So they may become more bankable. They should become more bankable as a result. The curriculum will be a designation, a certification that will be recognized, we anticipate, by the Green Bank Consortium. So they'll have an opportunity to bid on projects across the country. But how wonderful would it be for a person who lives and pick your neighborhood in the inner city of Cleveland to be able to participate in the construction of this new technology, and for their kids to see that. It takes participation to a different place. It drives revenue, but there's a piece of this that does more than create income. It fortifies the integrity of people in a place, and that's just as important to us. I'm sorry, and it will also, it's digital as well as in-person labs. So we recognize there's a digital divide, so we have devices with the appropriate sections as it relates to COVID, but there's also a digital application that we'll be pushing out through our website.
Great. So I got a question here from Isaac Corey, who kind of asked, and I think Tristan, you touched on this a little bit, but maybe if you can expound on it. How many panels does an average home need to install to generate enough power? And do you generally see through the co-op installations that are large enough to basically completely disconnect from the grid?
Yeah, so we deal with mainly grid-tied systems. So we, if you're connected to the grid, you should stay connected to the grid, and it allows the system to work really efficiently, and you get that net metering like we talked about. So not many folks choose to go off grid. You need batteries. You want to go off grid. 20 solar panels is about 6 kilowatts is what I have on my roof. It covers 90% of what I need on a yearly basis. Average in the state is 7 kilowatts, 24 panels. You can have 2 or 3 kilowatts, which is, 8 panels ish, and that's probably enough to cover some of your usage, and is a large enough system to offset some of the overhead costs. That's about as small as I think you'd want to go.
So John, you mentioned kind of some of the changes in state law that impacted our energy efficiency programs and the like. And I think we all know that energy efficiency is critically important. Can we talk a little bit at either the residential level or the community level, or and Tristan and Michael, feel free to jump in here as well, about kind of the value added of bundling the clean energy investment of the solar panels on the building or in the community solar, with bundling that with some of the energy efficiency investments. And have we seen that pay off, and what impact can that have for residents?
Yeah, well, I mean, the easiest thing to do is energy efficiency. I mean, that's just straight up true. It's the cheapest thing to do. It has the best return on its investment. And if you look at the clean energy jobs across the state of Ohio, of which we have a lot, most of that is energy efficiency, because that also requires labor in many cases. And so I think, the most important thing, and certainly Michael and I have talked about this on the community solar side, is to pair these things together. I mean, that's really where you can, because energy efficiency is going to help reduce your energy costs. It's going to help ensure that you actually have to use less of that electricity that's coming off the solar field because you've simply done the work that you need to do to just make sure that your house is as efficient as it can be. I mean, just as a personal story, when I bought my 1912 house in Lakewood, I was paying about $300 a month in December, January, February. I did energy efficiency. I did not replace my windows because that is not the best bang for your buck in most cases. But I did a lot of insulation and a lot of other things. And my average winter bill is about $110 a month now. I mean, it's a significant savings that I saw, and that investment was a few $1,000s. So there are, I think energy efficiency often doesn't get as much play in this conversation as it should. But frankly, it's the easiest way to save money. And certainly when you pair it with clean energy, you do a whole bunch of great things. You reduce your own personal energy costs, you reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions because you're using less electricity. It's a really win-win. And I think that's what we should always think about. It's nice to have these sort of sexy new technologies like, well, solar and wind are not new, but they are more sexy. Energy efficiency paired with that is really the way to think about it, and to really be mindful about that.
I'd add to that. Part of what makes energy efficiency work is consumer behavior. And so we toss around and we're looking at different innovations that will tell the occupant of the home how much energy they're saving by having a television off at that particular time, and how much they're expending if the lights are on. So how do we make this part of our understanding of how we consume the energy? And so if the aforementioned are paired together and we recognize how we manage energy consumption, how we can manage it better, this starts to drill down to the bottom line incredibly well. But it also means our outputs from an environmental perspective are a heck of a lot cleaner.
Great, thank you. So I think we've got time for maybe one last question from the group here. And David Wolin, I think this is an interesting question, particularly as we see more discussions around supply chain issues, just generally in the world. But David asked, what about thinking globally, actually nationally, and acting locally in supply chain? The largest domestic producer of panels for solar is building a huge manufacturing plant in Toledo, and there are domestic producers of the rest of the system here as well. This would spread job creation beyond Northeast Ohio. So I guess kind of paraphrasing that into a question is, what can or should we be doing and thinking about to maybe spur to create some of that supply chain activity here locally, and how could increasing demand locally help us do that?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, one of the great benefits of Ohio is that we make parts. We make parts for cars, we make parts for all kinds of things. We also make a lot of parts for clean energy, particularly in the wind turbines. We have a lot of small manufacturers that make the ball bearings for wind turbines. But I think, to your question, we need to do more. I think there's just a lot of opportunity. Obviously, the more demand you have in state for these things, the greater opportunity local manufacturers have to connect, to become part of that supply chain. And there's been a lot of studies that have been done about the wind supply chain in Ohio. There's an excellent report called the Clean Energy Jobs Midwest report, which talks about this kind of thing. But our great opportunity in Ohio, because we have so many small manufacturers who know how to fabricate parts, who make things like ball bearings, is huge. It's a great opportunity. And the more demand we have locally, the more demand we have statewide, the easier it's going to be to connect those manufacturers to that demand, and really make them part of this clean energy supply chain that I think Ohio can lead in. We need better policy. That is the only way we're going to be able to do that. But a lot of that, I do think Cleveland is really leading the way here. And as we all know, we have lots of small manufacturers in Cleveland. I don't want to take away from the large solar manufacturing facility that's being built here in Ohio. That's really important. But there are also a lot of small parts that go into all of these different pieces and components. And we have an opportunity here to really take advantage of the manufacturing sector that is a large part of our economy, and help them transition to start making parts for that, for the clean energy economy.
I think one of the things we've learned about supply chain is just how vulnerable it can be. And so to John's point, having manufacturing in our backyard and coordinated manufacturing is only to the benefit of not only the region, but connectivity to the supply chain. But there's a logistics piece to this, and some of that is policy driven, as it relates to ports and how we move commerce. So I think the question from the gentleman is spot on. We have to think about manufacturing and supply chain a bit differently than we did in times past. But to use the physical plant nature of automotive we saw what that did for communities like Detroit. And John mentioned the small manufacturers. You begin to build business, you begin to build households, you build middle class, you build wealth. So we know that formula works. And as we look ahead, the fixed physical nature of the worker and the nature of the business has shifted. And so manufacturing will always be core. I mean, we should be thinking about manufacturing from a global perspective, but we should also be thinking less about proximity and more about delivery. And how do we deliver the solutions, where they need to go efficiently and profitably. That mechanism of supply chain is changing quickly, and I think we'll have to look at it differently.
All right. Well, I guess to wrap up with one final question, and this is one that I think is, I got asked this the other day, and it's a good question, so I'm going to ask you guys as well. So we do a lot of these plans that look to 2040 or 2050. So our goal is tied to 2050. Our goal is tied towards our clean energy plan is a 2050 plan. It's hard sometimes to kind of conceptualize that timeline. So what should the next 5 years look like for us in Cleveland? What should the next 10 years look like? What should we be doing as kind of these final thoughts as we wrap up the last 4 minutes of this panel? What would you like to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years for us to be successful as we progress towards this ultimate goal in 2050?
I'll start this off. I think that, as John mentioned, having CPP and having such a focus the city does have on sustainability at your disposal really creates the opportunity to do microgrids, tons of distributed solar, community solar, rooftop solar programs for low-income areas, working with CMHA to do, wind, solar, all kinds of different things you could be doing. Of course, I'm focused on solar. It's what I do, so I'm going to talk a lot about solar. But there are other things you can be doing, and I'm seeing the beginnings of that. So I'm really excited to see what the future holds for Cleveland and how they're going to use CPP to leverage clean energy to have a better, equitable sort of solution for folks and resilient. I think that's really is a key.
Michael, you want to go next?
Sure. I think we've got to run like our lives depend on it. There needs to be a sense of urgency in getting this innovation in place, because the upside is greater if we do that. And we need to ensure that while we're doing that, participation is high. We've got some of the strongest academic institutions of higher ed right here in our backyard, and so we can create pipeline and we can educate. But those institutions like Cleveland State University also have climate action plans. And so I think over maybe the course of some recent time, we've all run our respective paths in a hope that we would in some way be able to coordinate. And now is the time for us to coordinate our efforts. And that includes CPP, that includes the state, and then certainly federal infrastructure, but in a way that we can all participate. We've experienced the cost of limited participation. We've experienced the cost to economies and communities for exclusionary participation. And so we've got a chance to get it right. The next 5-10 years will set the pace for the next 50.
I don't know that I have much more to add. I mean, what I will tell you just is I'm lucky to sit in a seat where I see a lot of things happening here in Cleveland. And we have remarkable people, some of them on this panel. We have remarkable things that we've been working on. I mean, Tristan's onto a model of solar co-ops that I think can be rapidly deployed over the next 5 years in ways we haven't even yet unleashed. He's got the model, he's ready to go. I think Michael's got a model for community solar, working with the city of Cleveland, working with Cleveland Public Power, where we could in 5 years have significant community solar across the city of Cleveland. And I do think it's 5 years. Like, I think that time horizon is not far off. I think that we have these things in place, and I truly believe if we can just focus on them and get them done, we're going to lead the world in some of this stuff. And that just may be my deep love of this place and the fourth generation Clevelander that I am. But I truly believe it. I believe that we have the right people, we have the right ideas, and now we've got some of the right models in place. They're going to rapidly elevate this stuff. We're going to, I think in 5 years, we are going to really be proud of ourselves for what we have done in Cleveland, and we will have become I hope, a global model of how you do this transition right.
I think that is an excellent way to wrap this up. I would like to thank our panelists, Tristan Rader, Michael Jeans, and John Mitterholzer, for a wonderful discussion. I'd like to thank Cleveland Public Library for hosting us again. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending and submitting such great questions. That will wrap up our Equitable Clean Energy Future panel discussion. The next panel start at 3:30. I would encourage you to join in for a series of more really interesting discussions. And if you want to learn more about energy efficiency, I believe we have an energy efficiency panel tomorrow and a panel on electric vehicles. So other areas where we're making good progress. So with that, I will say goodbye to you all, and we'll see you at the next panel. Thanks, everyone.